Thank you all for coming, and sorry that we're getting started a little late. I've heard there's some traffic out there, so maybe we'll have some people straggling in, but I want to get going with the program. So first and foremost, I just want to welcome you all here, and thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us. We think this discussion is really important and really timely, and focusing on rail transportation and rail safety seems to be large, not just in the freight space, but in the passenger space, and so we've assembled a great panel here to talk about that. We think that it's a boon to our economy, and everyone benefits from it, increased traffic in both commuter rail and freight rail. But in order to continue to enjoy these benefits, rail infrastructure needs to stay modern and well-maintained, and most important, it needs to be safe. So we asked you all to join us because we believe that positive and proactive efforts to identify issues and improve safety is a far better approach than reacting to incidents and infrastructure breakdowns after they occur. To that end, we've assembled this great panel, as I mentioned, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to AII's Chairman and CEO, Brigham McCown, to get the morning started and introduce.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'd like to thank Shane for putting it together, and the staff as well that have put a lot of, as we all know, put the real hours and work into this event. I'd also like to thank Addison Smith. Addison, thanks for making this location available for us. Really do appreciate it very much. And I'd like to thank the panel and the moderator for being here today. Just a tiny advertisement on AII. AII is the Alliance for Innovation and Infrastructure. It's an alliance between the National Infrastructure Safety Foundation, which is a 501c3, and the Public Institute for Facility Health, a C4. It's focused on examining innovative and outside-of-the-box policy solutions to address infrastructure and mobility challenges we have through both awareness and education. I'm honored to serve as the chairman and hope you'll have an opportunity to review, if you haven't already, a recently released study on rail technologies and best practices, which we have available here today. Being a former regulator, I like the word safety, I like the word innovation. In fact, I like them a lot. Safety is something that should be at the forefront of what we think about. It's something I wake up with in the morning. It's something I think about all day long. And I, for one, believe that we can have both safety and efficiency in moving our transport network forward. So while recent actions have focused on certain aspects of the industry, our goal is to recalibrate all stakeholders and call for an expanded focus on prevention as our first line of defense. Collaborative efforts to bring together diverse stakeholders aimed at utilizing innovation to drive safety decisions in order to identify, analyze, model, predict, and prevent incidents should be our watchword, and prevention should be our shield. And so today, our panelists are going to shed some light on lots of issues and bring their expertise to bear. I'd also like to point out that AII sent out personal invitations to PHMSA, to the FRA, to RSI, to the AAR, to the Class 1 railroads, to Amtrak, shippers, safety experts, and others. I'd like to commend those present here for joining us in our mission of improving safety. It's up to each of us to convince everyone else to join the conversation in the future, and we'll certainly keep trying to do so. With that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the discussion, Jason Forney, the editor of Argus Rail Business. And Jason has some material up here with Argus, if you would pick it up. We really appreciate you volunteering to moderate the panel today, and his experience and insight in this industry sector is well respected, and we're very lucky to have you and each of the other panel members with us. So, Jason, I turn it over to you, sir.
All right, thanks, Brigham.
Thank you.
All right, and as you mentioned, we're focusing on sort of a proactive discussion today, hopefully positive, forward-looking, and we want to get into both the passenger rail system and the freight side, with a focus on crude, where a lot of the public discussion has been lately. Just to sort of set the scene, I guess it was the July 2013 derailment in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, that has really pushed this issue to the forefront of the public's mind. As I'm sure most of you are aware, there was 47 people died when a runaway train ran into town and exploded in the middle of town. Enormous loss of life, and seemed to kick the process into what ended up being a new suite of tank car rules issued in May by the Department of Transportation. And then this year we've seen a series of crude derailments, some pretty nasty ones, Lynchburg, Virginia, Mount Carbon, West Virginia, that are bad for everybody. The railroads don't like them, the public obviously doesn't like them. So I wanted to frame the discussion in that way, and also to mention two major regulatory initiatives that are coming into play, and that's positive train control, which is a $9 billion system currently being installed by the railroads that is seen as really increasing safety through the technology, GPS positioning, and other measures. So just one statistic I wanted to mention on the positive side is something cited by DOT Secretary Tony Fox when he released the rules, and that's 99.9% of crude trains arrive at their destinations safely. But he says he wants perfection. I guess one derailment is too many, but that is one thing that I wanted to mention. So today we have a great panel. To my right is David Friedman, Vice Chair of the Transportation Research Board. To his right, Joseph Kane, who's a researcher at the Brookings Institution. Beth Tressiter, who's a policy advisor with the American Petroleum Institute. David Willauer, who's manager of transportation technological hazards at IEM. And then we have Sean Jean-Gale, who's vice president of the National Association of Railroad Passengers. So we've got quite a mix here. To start things off, I guess in general terms, I wanted to get an idea of what are the benefits of a reliable and safe rail system on the freight passenger side. So I wanted to toss that to Joseph Kane of the Brookings Institute, see if you could talk about that a little bit. What are the benefits to the economy of a safe system?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, I think it's important when we're considering all these different safety issues, right, taking a step back, knowing that a safe and reliable infrastructure network, right, is ultimately serving broader economic growth, right, that our rail infrastructure is connecting hundreds of different regions domestically and internationally, and then ultimately satisfying the demands of many different consumers, producers, travelers throughout the country. We just look at passenger rail, more than 20,000 miles of short and long distance routes nationally. And Amtrak is seeing record levels of ridership, over 31 million passengers annually, about 55% more than 1997, and exceeding really most other domestic modes over this span, including domestic aviation. Really supporting business travelers, tourists, particularly in our densest urban corridors. The 100 largest metros nationally account for 90% of Amtrak's total ridership. So as we kind of look at these safety issues, especially on the passenger side, right, we think of the Northeast Corridor, a lot of these urban corridors are particularly important in that respect. But then obviously freight rail, right, with crude by rail movements is also important. About 140,000 rail miles nationally operated by our Class 1, 2, and 3 railroads. Car loads in 2014 were up to over 15 million, which is about 4% more than in 2013, and their highest levels since 2008. And I'm sure several of our other panelists will speak to this, but our energy products in particular are driving a lot of that. Minus sudden fluctuations currently too. But you can imagine, right, with all of this increased traffic, it leads to more delays, bottlenecks, and just pure wear and tear on the tracks themselves, which leads to kind of these safety concerns that we're going to talk about, and then just these larger investment needs. According to the World Economic Forum, U.S. rail infrastructure ranks 15th internationally, so we're not exactly leading in that respect. And then, we can look at the traditional sort of ASCE report card, right? C+ is our grade for rail infrastructure. So there's a lot of kind of just national issues in that respect, in addition to just several long-standing projects that could use help that we've seen in the news lately, like the Hudson River rail tunnels that are over a century old that could cost commuters and businesses hundreds of millions of dollars if they were ever shut down. So I think, there's a lot of kind of gloom and doom in this space too, but there's a lot of good. Two, we see a lot of investment happening, particularly between federal, state, and local players. Hopefully with the passage of CREA for passenger rail, we can see more of this success at a national level. And then freight rail, right? The freight railroads themselves are pumping over $600 billion over the past 30 years into track improvements. So I think through this broader lens, right, of what is happening on the passenger rail side of things, what is happening on freight rail, among all these different stakeholders beyond DC, public and private, how are we going to address these larger safety concerns, ultimately to produce kind of that economic growth that we need following the recession?
So obviously safety, economic growth, a reliable system, very dependent on each other, go hand in hand. And you mentioned energy products. I'd like to discuss that a little bit, sort of in terms of what we're seeing right now. The oil prices dropped quite a bit, which has led to a decline in rail traffic. But as far as where we are with current traffic levels, I wanted to direct that to Beth. What are you seeing right now in terms of crude traffic and the system?
Sure. Well, crude traffic depends on a number of factors, including alternative transportation modes, the unloading infrastructure that currently exists at refineries, existing contractual commitments, and of course price. When we're talking about price, it's more about the price differential between domestic crude and imported crude, WTI and Brent, that it would be about the overall cost, because that'll help determine whether refineries want to rail crude from the Bakken, for example, or import it from overseas. So using the Bakken as an example, in 2013, about over 70% of crude oil from North Dakota was railed, primarily to the east and the west coast refineries. And that was when there was a significant differential between WTI costs and Brent. And since then, those price differentials have collapsed, and now what we're seeing is, since there's that price collapse, in that differential, we're seeing a lot more of the crude by rail dropping. So in May, it was at 52%. This is again specifically for the Bakken, and then in June, it was down to 47% of Bakken moving by rail. So we've seen that decrease significantly, and I think with increased pipeline capacity from North Dakota and production leveling off, we'll likely continue to see that crude by rail movement can drop. Another thing to keep in mind is refiners on the east and west coast have invested in this infrastructure. They might own fleets, they might have built unloading terminals, also they'll have contractual requirements. So those will all lead them to potentially continue to invest in crude by rail and continue to use crude by rail, even if that price differential lowers. So I think we'll continue to see a dropping in crude traffic by rail.
Does that drop, and anybody, these questions are open to anybody, does the drop in profits affect investment, and could that have a negative impact on safety? Especially since passenger rail and freight obviously share the same lines a lot of times. Do you have any thoughts, Beth? Or
Sure. Well, I think the rails have committed to it in terms of the investment in the actual rail infrastructure. I think the railroads have committed to a significant amount of rail infrastructure investment, and despite the fluctuations in which commodities they're carrying, that investment will ultimately continue, I imagine. So I don't know if that will have as much of an impact on the actual infrastructure investment. In terms of the loading and unloading infrastructure, I know on the West Coast there are several projects that have been proposed. That's more of an issue of getting those projects permitted at this point. I think it's, obviously if those refineries are looking at options between bringing domestic crude from the Bakken or importing it via barge, they're going to go most likely with the cheaper transport option. So that, yes, I think that could potentially affect their investments in the unloading infrastructure.
Let me also add that some of the refineries in the East Coast, particularly, for example, the Philadelphia refineries, which may actually not even be operating if it weren't for some of the Bakken crude. They were in the past taking crude from the Nigerian sources, which was a light sweet, and the replacement of Bakken from a political point of view was easier as well as a cost point of view. So there was so as Beth pointed out correctly, these refineries have made an investment in unloading and in their cars, and we anticipate that they will continue to likely move by rail for the near future.
Yeah, the other reason I think we'll continue to see rail in the picture is that it's got some flexibility that pipelines don't have. And the investment in a rail line, the rail lines already connect to these refineries around the country. This oversupply of shale oil is causing some interesting challenges because all of our Gulf Coast refineries are set up for the heavy crude oil. And they can only mix so much of it with the light oil from Bakken. So we are exporting some of the lightest oil, the condensate, to Canada, and that's coming back to us through the pipelines as a diluent. And we're now, I just learned last week, exporting some light oil to Mexico in exchange for the heavy oil in the Gulf of Mexico, for the Gulf Coast refineries. And so there's some Gulf Coast movements of the different kinds of oil that are significant, and rail connects to those facilities as well.
Getting back to Jason's question, I mean, from a passenger perspective, crude by rail is more of a performance issue rather than a safety issue. We haven't seen any incidents per se between Amtrak trains and crude oil by rail, but we have seen on-time performance apply it, and the delays have been like an hour or two, and 8, 10, 12-hour delays, which has really hurt ridership out in the areas where they're transporting these tank cars. So we're looking at, are the freight railroads going to invest at a sufficient level that they're ready for the next surge, and that passengers aren't, hurt to the same degree that they were this time around, because it kind of caught everyone by surprise.
I see, and of course the railroads, when they start losing one commodity, they'll just move to another one. Right now it's grain and agriculture that they're moving towards. So even with the crude traffic drops, could we see it replaced? I mean, they'll probably keep running the same amount of trains if they can, right?
Well, you actually had, grain in silos rotting, and you had senators come in, Senator Boone, and hold hearings on it. Okay, this is time-sensitive cargo, and we have to get it to market. What are you going to do? And so there was a massive, that was affecting mainly BNSF customers, and so there was a massive reallocation of workers and also freight cars. So they were butting up against the same capacity. So I do expect to be some constraints there.
Okay, good. And the Surface Transportation Board is actually meeting later this month in Kansas City to talk about the grain cars and the upcoming harvest. It's a very cyclical business, obviously. When the harvest comes in, you have a lot of product to move. And as you mentioned, there's political pressure because when the farmers have to store their grain, it can be counted as an asset. So it's very costly to them, and agriculture, of course, being such an important industry for us. You mentioned John Toon. He has been one of the proponents of extending the deadline for positive train control. Just to set that up real quickly, this is a law that was mandated by Congress in 2008 with a deadline at the end of this year to implement the system. As I said, it's a $9 billion system. Every Class 1 has told Congress there's no way we're going to make it. CSX has said we're not going to be there until 2020. And then you have the Federal Railroad Administration, who has promised to start fining the railroads, and it creates all kinds of problems if they're out of compliance with this. So as far as a PTC extension, can anybody comment on the implications of that, and whether, if anyone has an opinion as to whether it should be extended or should they hold their feet to the fire on that deadline?
I mean, from our perspective, focusing on commuters, and APTA has estimated that only 30% of commuter systems will be in compliance.
Yep.
And there's a, yeah, well, by the deadline, it's not a question of if it's extended, but how. And so we have, working with the operators and the freight railroads, discussing the problems. We recognize the need for an extension, but we think it should not be a blanket 5-year extension. It should be case by case, handled by the FRA, and there should be benchmarks involved in order to ensure that the work is being done. I think 3 years is a good compromise, and that it's been floating out there, and it certainly with what happened in Philadelphia with that Amtrak train, I think there's a greater understanding among the public that this is a technology whose time has come.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see PTC brought into the public eye. We're seeing editorials in Washington Post on it, so it's really becoming a political issue. Especially National Transportation Safety Board has had this on their list of recommendations since the late 60s, I think. So the railroads have not been very quick to jump on that, and there's various reasons for that. As far as FRA, can anybody speak about the conflict that would be set up? A railroad's going to have to choose between moving freight or possibly being liable for penalties and fines for if they continue to run trains after that deadline. Is that going to affect freight traffic, passenger traffic? If that it seems like something that could cause some chaos out there.
Well, we've heard that, at least from the commuter side, and I think from the freight side, that they're going to look at, commuters specifically they're across the board required, and they're going to start looking at notifying their customers about discontinuance of service if there's no extension past around October for that. There's a federal requirement that there's some lead up time to give people some notice and a heads up. It's 50. The FRA has quoted a number that was in PREA 2008, $15,000 to $25,000 per locomotive not in compliance per day. If you look at commuter railroads, they don't have that kind of margin. They can't afford that. So the FRA has said, we're going to follow the law and institute these fines. I don't see how the commuter railroads have any choice. They can't mint money. The sad part would be let's say that the extension doesn't get passed, you would have commuters shifted onto the highway, which is a much less safe mode in terms of death per passenger mile, and you would also, from a freight perspective, have some toxic materials kicked out to the highway from the U.S. rail network, where again it's much safer. So I would expect an extension for the concept.
I would add that, we're talking about rail here, but it's also in conjunction with all of our other transportation assets across different regions, right? So, if there's a supply and a demand, it's going to have to move in some capacity. And so, if FRA, right, is going to have a pretty stringent approach to this, suppliers demand, timely shipments, and that's not going to stop, so they'll probably ship it to trucks, right? Mm-hmm. Or to other modes, wherever that capacity is going to actually address the issues. So I think, as we talk about sort of the rail safety issues, it seems very small and targeted, but it really, I think, ripples throughout the larger system, right, in the months ahead.
Yeah, there's been some interesting exchanges with Sarah Feinberg before Congress, and they're giving her a hard time about enforcing the deadline. She's saying, well, it's your deadline. You created this deadline, so that's an interesting political thing to watch there. It was mentioned right now our infrastructure has a grade of C+. Does anybody have ideas as ways to improve on that? It's about profits. The railroads need to make adequate profits in order to do that. But are there ways to drive investment that we've not really discussed or tackled?
I would just say, again, kind of everyone looks at it as sort of there's this massive problem at hand that there's going to be like the silver bullet solution, right? And this is true for all types of infrastructure, almost this cartoonish problem that's just so out of proportion that we need a huge solution to solve it. But it's going to come down to really targeting the investments precisely at a local level. Where are the pinch points, whether it be Chicago or elsewhere, or in the middle of an intermodal transfer facility somewhere? Where are we going to target these investments, and then how are we going to govern that adequately at a federal, state, and local level between, again, the public and private sector, and getting all of these stakeholders together to kind of really address the issues or even quantify them. I mean, we don't really have the data on hand really beyond just kind of these top level measures, right? And we have a gap of X many dollars and a grade of C+, what does that really mean on a day-to-day basis? So I think, there are efforts underway, certainly in DC and at the state level, a lot of good rail plans and efforts to sort of address these issues, but there's clearly a lot more work ahead to sort of drive the investments, which, I mean, again, in turn kind of lead to those safety improvements I think we're looking for in terms of tracks and signals and so on.
You can see some of that taking place already, because what railroads will do in situations where track improvements need to be made but can't be made in a certain time frame is they'll drop the speeds. And so when you see speeds drop nationwide in the railroad network, that has an impact on a little bit of everything as well. So even though it's a short-term measure, it is one way to gauge areas where more infrastructure improvements are needed. And when you have those speeds dropping, the new rules call for across the board reduction of speed for high hazard flammable trains. And that's also been recognized by the railroads as a bit of a setback for them, because they already have other ways to govern speed in terms of geometry and urban density and condition of the track that they already apply pretty rigorously. And so because track conditions are so important, I think you'll see railroads making those investments, because that's really the foundation of the railroad system. There are not as many attributes pointing at things like brake failures that lead to these accidents. That's a very, very small proportion, but it's track improvements and human behavior that have higher percentages in terms of these rail incidents. And with those track improvements come bridges. Some of the bridges that failed in recent years were as old as I think one rail bridge was built in 1874. And that's still in service today. And that tells you a little bit about the age of our rail infrastructure.
Or at least anecdotally, in the winter seasons. And so, one of the things that we're working on continually is as more crude has been transported by rail, engaging our pipeline companies and our pipeline investors with the rail industry to see whether there are areas where we can share information or best practices or technologies to identify areas where there are similar improvements that can be made given the similarities in the types of infrastructure. So that's something where it's not a regulation or it's not coming from the regulatory side, but definitely in terms of sharing information between industries, we see a lot of potential there.
And just to add, what Beth mentioned on mainline movements, east-west, making sure that the rail inspections are not only just done, but maybe done +1, or to go the extra effort on these lines that are running significant unit trains.
Yeah, infrastructure, a big issue. We recently had just the past couple of weeks of, I think it was a Union Pacific, not to put them on the spot, one of their bridges collapsed a half hour after a train had just run over it. So, we are seeing, as you mentioned, it's an old system. Depending on the railroad, there's a lot of investment going on, and hopefully that will change things. We talked a little bit about data. Surface Transportation Board has required a lot more data from railroads about their movements. The railroads are not pleased about that. They've been fighting it. There's more and more data that they want: train speed, dwell times. It's considered industry protected information. On the petroleum side, is that obviously something that's beneficial to shippers? The more you know, the better it is. just in
Yeah,
terms
I
of?
think everyone's interested in the data. I think even the public is more interested than ever before in the types of rail traffic. Some of it's pretty obvious. When you see a unit train come through your town, it's a pretty big event, right? And so people are aware of it, but they want to know how much it's going to happen, how frequently it's going to happen, and there's a lot of public appetite for that information. At the first responder level, they usually can get this data and have been working closely with the railroads already. And I'm happy to say that some of our recent examples include West Virginia, where the Mount Carbon incident that you mentioned was a good example of a town that saw these trains coming through about this time last year, and they started saying, we need to do something about this. So they started training with CSX. They did some proactive exercises over last winter. And so when that derailment occurred in February of this year, in the middle of a blizzard, they knew what to do. They trained with CSX and they'd had some experience firsthand. So there are examples of first responders taking the initiative to learn about railroad protocols and railroad responses to these incidents and being prepared. Even though they had to pretty much let the fire burn, they weren't prepared to put out a fire of that magnitude. That's the other part that I think firefighters are facing today. We've seen crude oil for years. We've not seen crude oil with liquid, natural gas liquids mixed in, like propane and butane, shipped at these volumes before. That's the game changer, the volume and the type of product that's being shipped. And that's what's sending firefighters into training sessions to reevaluate how they're going to deal with that.
One thing I would add to that, while we haven't seen, crude oil has definitely increased in volume in terms of the number of shipments due to the domestic energy renaissance. And, especially out of North Dakota, when this boom started to happen in 2011, 2012, there was a lack of pipeline infrastructure. And so there was a movement towards building rail infrastructure. While that's taking place, flammable liquids have been shipped by rail for decades. So, while the specific commodity might change, overall, our first responders are prepared for flammable liquid events. You respond to a flammable liquid event, whether it's a Packing Group 1 Class 3 hazmat or a Packing Group 2 Class 3 hazmat in the exact same way. And typically, given the number of resources, sometimes that will involve, like David said, letting a fire burn out, which can be an alternative to a spill. And so even if something, there are different options that firefighters have, but what we've actually done at API is work with the railroads on a crude by rail educational course that we've been rolling out across the country to help educate first responders so that they know more information about this product, how it's similar to other flammable liquids, and to be prepared in case of an incident.
Another dynamic there is more information is given to first responders. The public wants it. Maryland recently won a court case where some journalists had put a FOIA request in for the crude training data, and the railroad sued to try and stop that. Does anybody have a position on that issue? I mean, are the railroads just being a little bit overprotective of their information here, or, I mean, it's obviously going to increase safety the more, the more information that we have.
I would say it's always a balancing act. We need to be aware of potential security concerns that come out of divulging too much information. So I think we need to tread carefully when it comes to information dissemination.
Right. Terrorism.
Yeah, we do the same thing with hazmat preparedness, helping first responders know what's going through their backyard. They need to know that, but you don't want that information to get into the wrong hands either.
Right.
In terms of the movement of chemicals and so forth. The other part about the rail system in this country is geographic. I think it's important to note that rail systems connect our cities. We know that because we built them that way. But the other factor is that rail systems follow river corridors for the most part. And so they're going to be susceptible to the kinds of flooding and events that happen with rivers. So there's washouts. And there's situations that happen along rivers, so that when you have a rail incident, you're also going to have an environmental incident as well, when you have rail runs following river corridors, which is pretty common. So, another factor.
Yeah, and on the first responder issue, it's an evolving relationship here. Recently, some first responders sued a railroad because they weren't given enough information about the toxic inhalants that were burning. They say they suffered from that. So that seems to be another issue that's coming into play, is regional, sort of an emergency commander in one area might, as you mentioned, say, we need more preparedness here, where another region might not think about it until they have an incident. So maybe something to follow there. I was wondering, on the passenger rail side, what are some of the bigger challenges that you think in terms of the system? Is it just capacity that is your main focus? Or?
It's capacity, but also the state of the infrastructure, which is poor. When you say C+ rail infrastructure, I kind of wonder if the passenger side is bringing down that grade a little bit. When you look at the Northeast Corridor alone, just to get it to a state of good repair, it's $52 billion, and that's a few years old, that estimate, so it's probably higher in actuality, and that doesn't address the Baltimore Potomac Tunnel between that runs under Baltimore on the Northeast Corridor that you'll go through if you go to New York City, which dates back to the Civil War. It doesn't talk about building a new set of rail tunnels between New York and New Jersey under the Hudson River. And those are all going to be needed to expand capacity. And in regards to the Gateway project, it's going to be needed just to maintain fluid movement on the corridor, because those tunnels are going to fail. We know they're going to fail within a decade. And if Amtrak has to shut down one of the pair of the rail tunnels, that's 75% of capacity between New Jersey and New York City. And that tunnel alone carries 400,000 people a day. So, what we saw post Hurricane Sandy, where there was like a fleet of buses across the river and a lot of people walking, that would be the situation we'd be looking at for 10 years or something. And it's going to be, there's going to be some town on the New Jersey side of that river that's going to be a boom town if that ever happens. So I think the solution is predictable, dedicated funding, and we know we need to do it. And there's a lot of ideas floating about how to pay for it, but no one's kind of solidified behind a single one. So I think Justin's right. It's about targeting and looking at bringing as many options to the table as possible. So it's a little bit of both, but I would focus more on finding a rail trust fund and getting it out of the appropriation cycle.
I would add, it's when it comes to our passenger rail network, right? It's a national network providing really this geographic equity across the country, but there is a tremendous concentration of traffic along those short line corridors, particularly the Northeast Corridor along the West Coast, parts of the Midwest. And what we are seeing in lieu kind of this federal leadership on the issue, right, that, where's the money coming from? A lot of states have stepped up over time. Virginia, North Carolina, Maine with the Downeaster. Several individual routes have shown great performance in their ridership and their operating finances. So perhaps, in lieu of kind of this broader federal solution, which may come someday, but, we need to kind of look at what are individual regions, particularly states, doing on their passenger rail issues to really cater to those commuters and travelers. It's not just a tourism issue, it's actually catering, particularly along the Northeast Corridor, right? You're going to take a train from DC to New York versus a plane in most cases. So it's really a fundamental sort of business issue for a lot of people. So I would just say, when we're looking at these broader infrastructure concerns and we're sort of looking to target them, we need to see where are the stresses happening most frequently, and at least on passenger rail, it's along those short line corridors.
Yeah, and you've also seen privately led shoreline corridors being developed. One in Florida between Orlando and Miami, and one in Texas between Houston and Dallas. They all have unique properties that allow the private sector to lead. And, Florida is as much a real estate development project as it is a transportation project, because FEC Industries happen to own a giant parcel of undeveloped land in Miami, and big developments. So there are opportunities for P3, but I do think there has to be a strong government leadership. It's probably federal. I mean, if you look at how other national networks have been built, it's the federal government that's led.
And the state's obviously seen as far behind a lot of other countries in rail development, infrastructure. Once again, politics. Any thoughts on some of the hostility in Congress towards Amtrak? There's congressmen that want to cut the funding, privatize it. Obviously something you wouldn't be in favor of.
Yeah, no, we would not. I'd say the forces of de-evolution have kind of won on the passenger rail front. They're in a stalemate in the highway side of things, but we saw with PREA 2008 a shifting of operating responsibility for every line under 750 miles, which means, except for the Northeast Corridor, which is still federal, and Amtrak. And they're kind of trying to freeze the long distance routes in amber, to say whatever you have now, that's what you're going to have in perpetuity. Which, when you look at the ridership, it's a real shame, because there's room for growth there. And as we add 80 to 100 million people between now and 2050, we're going to need more capacity. I don't think there's unfortunately, Congress is not going to operate in good order, so there's no single vote you can really point to. They've tried their best to create a solid line when they voted to slash funding for Amtrak the day after the Philadelphia accident. But it's more, I think, apathy and what I keep hearing as I go along around to different offices is the Highway Trust Fund is a sinking ship. You guys really want to get on it, and we do, because we're already in the North Atlantic fighting on a door, and a sinking ship seems better than what we're at right now. But because they've already spent almost twice as much in general funds shoring up the Highway Trust Fund in the last 6-7 years than they have on Amtrak in its entire history. So they'll find a way to save the HDF. I don't think we can keep going year-to-year appropriations battle and expect a good outcome for Amtrak long term.
Transportation in general. Just to stay on passengers for a little bit, we recently saw a foiled terrorist attack on a train running between Amsterdam and Paris. Is that something that is getting more attention, the risk of terrorism? Both, I guess that would apply on the freight side too. Are you seeing a need for more attention to that?
Well, I know that Transportation Security Administration and Homeland Security are going to have an event actually in the station today at 2 o'clock. So I just learned about that last night, and they may be proposing some sort of initiative. We're a membership-based group, and our members are really against the TSA-ification of rail travel. It's not feasible if you look at the 500 plus Amtrak stations across the country. You're not going to seal it off. When you've seen TSA try to impose themselves on the on Amtrak stations, they kind of bungled the job. There was an incident 3 or 4 years ago in Savannah, Georgia, where they actually were screening passengers who were coming off a train. And it's just, I don't think we need more TSA in our lives. There are other ways they can help Amtrak police make trains more safe. The FCC has talked about giving more radio frequency to railroad police so that they can communicate better with police stations along the line in service communities. And I think, you know, there's a role for TSA's Viper teams if they want to be a little bit more intelligent in how they apply. But we don't want, you know, kind of that blanket airport security for trains. At least our group is not.
Yeah, hopefully we won't have to take our shoes off to get on the train. So the new tank car rules that were issued in May have created some controversy. On the petroleum side, how do you see this, the tank car standard? Do you think there's changes that should be made, or did they hit the mark on the regulation that is currently out?
Well, a couple things, and I want to go back a second because you mentioned Lock McGuinty, which really drove tank car rules. And just point out that when the Canadian Transportation Research Board, similar to their NTSB, came out with the analysis, there were 18 factors that they felt led to the tragedy. 17 of them had nothing to do with tank cars. It had to do with safety culture, safety practices, track issues, etc. The tank car issue was only one of 18. And yet, the focus really for the last 2 years has been on tank cars.
As David said, you know, the past few years that there's been a significant focus on that, but ultimately, you know, a tank car could potentially lessen the effects of a derailment, but it's not going to prevent a derailment. And so from our perspective, I think we need to, if our ultimate goal is to help prevent these incidents, we really need to focus on the root causes.
Other than tank car standards, what would you like to see on the regulatory side? Is it training, or all of the above?
I think it's a matter, it's all of the above, as Beth pointed out. You can mitigate a problem, but if you prevent it in the first place, you don't have to mitigate. And so it's a matter of looking at track integrity, it's a matter of looking at human factors, which those two are the biggest causes of derailments. And so there needs to be a focus. We have always talked about this holistic approach. That we need to look at all pieces. We need to look at mitigate. We do need to look at mitigation, but we need to look at prevention. We also need to look at response. And so all three of those really have to be done. We have to properly classify so that the first responders know what's being moved and what equipment we're using to move it. We need to have better track integrity, and then you know, we obviously need to have safer tank cars in place as well.
Are there any areas that are unexplored right now? You could comment on the passenger side, or Joseph, you might have something to say, that has not really been a focus. As David mentioned, there's a lot of focus on equipment. When you look at the risk factors in derailments, are there areas that are not being addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we kind of focus on the transportation side of things naturally, right? So we're talking about rail, but I mean, a lot of the work that I do deals with sort of economic development, right? That angle in individual regions, and there's a lot of interest, I think, kind of going back to the data side of things, having this geographic granularity of how much are we moving, both in terms of passengers and goods. What does it mean for our residents, our industries, in terms of really fueling that growth that we need? And it's highly varying across the country, right? From the Northeast to the West to the Midwest. And I think a lot of the safety sort of improvements in terms of technology or just track upgrades or so on sort of fit into that larger frame, I think, that a lot of regions are looking for. And I think it, you know, comes down to a lot of the federal issues, right, that are at play. But regardless of whatever the government does or does not do in the following months, they have a lot on their plate beyond even just rail. You know, regions are going to be looking for more of that certainty of how do they fit into this larger network, and how can they maybe tackle these challenges themselves.
And it's also a matter of funding, right? Is there adequate funding coming on the federal side for safety innovations?
I can't speak as much to the particular safety spending, but I mean, I think if we look across the board, right, in terms of just all infrastructure, right, in terms of highway trust fund, in terms of passenger rail, freight rail, we don't even know where to spend the money in most cases. It's kind of this peanut butter approach where we just sort of spread it throughout the country and it sort of rains down on different places, and you know, it's good for them because they can just put it wherever they want. They want the flexibility, but I think more importantly, they want the certainty, you know, rather than kind of going from one deadline to the next. I think that's true for rail and all other types of infrastructure.
And certainty not being a real benefit these days on the transportation side. For instance, they can't get contracting done on highways because of the highway trust fund lapses, things like that. So, are there any specific technologies? I don't know if anyone's an expert on this type of thing, but we're seeing a lot of changes in other industries where railroads are not seen as the most progressive investors. Is there anything that would make a big difference in terms of protecting the health of the rail system? Does anybody have any? I don't know who might be involved in that side of things, but you know, technologies that we have not seen yet.
One of the initiatives that we've undertaken, since there are many similarities between pipeline infrastructure and rail infrastructure, is trying to evaluate, get the industries together to share information about where there might be, where we can identify technologies and best practices. So, you know, those conversations are ongoing, but I think having started the conversation to share that information could potentially lead to those kinds of innovations. So I think, you know, we're sort of in the education and information sharing phase at this point, getting the right people talking and the right stakeholders engaged. But that's something that we hope to make progress on.
I think states are also putting pressure on the federal government to improve track inspections because they're doing it locally. Some states have taken the initiative to increase track inspections, put more inspectors on the tracks. But I think one of the challenges of the rail infrastructure inspection program is that you often can't see by looking at it visually whether that track is going to withstand the weight of a unit train that particular day. And the bridges are in that same category. So I think one of the innovations that we'll be seeing more of is more advanced inspection capabilities and types of calibrated instruments that can really tell about stress fractures and other parts of the infrastructure that could be compromised, and to deal with it before it becomes too bad.
Yeah, we saw a presentation by a company called Rail Scout that is creating unmanned autonomous rail inspection vehicles, so like drones on rails. And they're trying to equip some of those sensors you're talking about, sensor arrays, onto these drones and have them help in track inspection, but also run ahead of the train and just act as a kind of a first warning. So they're very much in the development process, but I expect that kind of technology will start to play a larger role in the future.
Sure. And BNSF, I think, is actually starting to use drones. They can right now only use them in line of sight, but are looking for permission to fly them everywhere. So it's probably something we'll be seeing more of. How about on the passenger side specifically? What do you think is the most important safety initiative that you would like to see? Would it be PTC or?
Yeah, I mean, the Federal Railroad Administration has identified PTC as the most important safety investment for the national network. And if you look at the three kind of black swan incidents that have happened since 2008, it's Chatsworth, California, 25 dead, 125 injured. There was Metro North Thanksgiving 2013, which was 4 dead, 61 injured, and Philadelphia, which is 8 dead and 200 plus injured. And so those are all PTC preventable. Again, it's 45 years that NTSB has been asking for it, so it's time to come. But a less glamorous program is the Section 130 grade crossing. It's much more frequent, and usually the person getting hurt isn't the passenger, the locomotive engineer, but a pedestrian who's trespassing, or a driver who wasn't paying attention and trying to beat the train. But when you can separate roadways from railways, the network as a whole is safer, and something that state DOT planners don't choose to spend the money on their own. So it's important to have this set aside, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I think, so, I'm sorry, you said your view on a PTC extension is you would not like to see a blanket extension, but more of a shorter?
Yeah, short-term, 3-year, case by case, with benchmarks that the railroads need to demonstrate that they are reaching in the in-between time. So it's not like, here's 3 years, go off and do something, because I think in that situation you might just find yourself in the exact same scenario where they're facing down a deadline they can't meet. But we want to make sure that the steps there's a realistic plan to meet that 3-year deadline, and I think it's achievable.
Would a lot of fines and penalties really wreak havoc on the passengers' side, do you think?
Yeah, some of these commuter authorities, they don't get any federal assistance for operating. It's local, city, NPOs, state governments that cover anything that's not covered by ticket revenue, and so these entities can't go into debt, and they have to plan out these budgets sometimes 1-2 years in advance, because they don't eat that often. So I expect it would in fact result in a discontinuance of service if a $15,000 fine per day was to be implemented, and again, that makes Americans less safe on their way to work.
On the crude by rail side, in terms of the PTC extension, what are the implications of the railroads going out of compliance as far as shipping crude?
It's not something that we've looked into extensively. So I, at this point, don't have any comments. It sounds, David?
No, I don't think we're in the same boat on that.
Okay.
Not that extensive.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the railroads have certain arguments about the impacts it's going to have on the system, and we'll see if Congress steps up and extends that. We did mention how America is behind other countries on our infrastructure. Can anybody comment on sort of the reasons for that on a broader philosophical sense? Is it just our anti-federalism in America, or why is this the case? I mean, rails are intrinsic to the economy, safety, transportation. Any broad comments on that, just on a higher level thought?
I would just say, right, we have been a leader in this space years ago, right? And I would say, probably in the past few decades in particular, there's kind of been this growing gap in the investment needs, right, in terms of just the age of a lot of our infrastructure, and then what we're actually putting into it. There's a lot of other spending priorities, particularly at a federal level, right, when we talk about the aging population, just a lot of other needs in the budget itself where we're not coming up with the needed money to cover some of these infrastructure upgrades. And so I think nationally there's kind of this big infrastructure challenge that a lot of other countries have taken more of a coordinated approach. They're looking at their rail upgrades in terms of their highway upgrades, in terms of their maritime upgrades, it's sort of a cohesive kind of approach so that they can then channel those investments appropriately. Whereas we are really taking sort of a scattershot, I think perspective in a lot of cases where it's, rail is over here, passenger rail is over here, freight rail is over here, highways are over here. But I think, hopefully in the months to come and hopefully the years to come, nationally, federal leaders will take more of that coordinated approach that I think we need.
I've thought about it because as I've traveled around the country to States as part of our advocacy work, and I have been called socialist multiple times. And I don't, it was Florida, so I don't know if that counts. But, I think the president, certainly, President Obama, kind of inflected investment in rail for a while, and I think that's slowly fading away. And we've seen that with recent vote counts in the House and the Senate, where it's become a little less polarized. Certainly, Republicans are more likely to resist investment in passenger trains, but I think we are moving the needle in a positive direction. And so I don't know whether it was just a brief moment or whether it speaks about some lines back to the American character.
Well, I think another factor is our aging population. We've got the baby boomer generation entering retirement, and we're going to see, I think, some people wanting some other choices. And passenger rail provides a different experience. We found that in the Downeaster revitalization in Maine. The ridership of the competing private bus company was expected to go down when rail service was reestablished to Portland, Maine. And it didn't. The ridership actually went up for both the rail and the bus systems because people had more choices. And I think as our aging population decides to rely less on their automobiles, they're going to look for other choices. And so I think we'll still continue to see rail investments in those areas where the population can sustain it. It's the long distance cross-country corridors that I think are going to be suffering.
Yeah. Well, I've seen demographic breakdowns of the different business lines, and it's interesting because Northeast Corridor dominated by 40 business travelers in the 40s and 50s. This is expensive. State corridors, Chicago, Milwaukee, Seattle, Portland is skews younger, under 30 demographic, and then long distance routes are dominated by senior citizens. And it's going to be one of those things where, I guess they have time to take a longer journey. But we're going to have to ask ourselves, do we want to provide an equal level of mobility across the entire nation? And I don't think we can answer that question. But it is, as far as the national network goes, long distance routes have been the ridership has been rising along with the rest of the business lines. But there has been kind of an existential crisis every other year where someone suggests eliminating all funding to them. So I don't know how long we keep fighting that off if the attacks keep going.
In terms of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One thing I was going to mention, I know that this is an issue for both the oil and the rail industries, is speaking of demographics, in terms of getting qualified engineers who can actually do the work and the improvements, that's a significant issue in terms of getting that skilled workforce. And I think the industries are facing a large-scale retirement, and so bringing in that skilled workforce who can actually do the work and take on the improvements is also an issue that many industries are facing.
Yeah, there was a recent report that came out that said I was really interested in the age of rail workers, and they're older. It's 5% are under age 25, and it's something like 50% are in their 50s. Is that going to be a big problem? Because same with trucking. Young people don't want to drive trucks. It's just not an attractive job these days. They also don't want to get out on work on the rail line at 5 in the morning. Can anybody speak to the worker issue?
It's a huge challenge across all infrastructure, right? Even think of our transit systems. A lot of bus drivers, subway operators. I believe DOT just came out with a report saying like more than half of all of our transportation infrastructure workers are over the age of 45. So it's clearly sort of a crisis reaching ahead in the years to come. But I think the larger thing to point out here too is the barriers to entry actually into these jobs are quite low in terms of educational requirements. And so when we're thinking of ways to expand opportunities post-recession, right? What are jobs that are providing good, sustainable wages, entry level with low barriers to entry? across workers for all skill levels, and these jobs, I think, fill that hole.
Great, and rail, something like 273,000 workers in the rail industry compared to 2 million in the trucking industry. So rail is a fairly small chunk of the workforce, but obviously a problem that's going to face rail and trucking.
I'd like to give some of the press an opportunity for Q&A if you guys have a couple minutes. And
For sure. Yeah, if you could just identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Kelly Madrick with CQ. I've got a question about transit. I thought it was really helpful that Sean mentioned the Gateway Project, the Hudson River Tunnels. Because to me, this is a great example of where transit kind of collides with the more popular subject we talk about, infrastructure, which is commercial movement of goods, freight movement. So can you talk about whether there needs to be more holistic focus on how transit plays in the transportation network? And is there a commercial benefit to that? And I'm obviously interested in Sean's answer here, but I also like to hear from some of the petroleum and chemical folks, if possible, Beth, David. So is there a commercial benefit to aligning these movements? And can you provide some examples of how you're working on that now? Or is there a consequence to not doing so?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously congestion is an issue. As you have certain commodities booming in certain areas, they might, there are more trains that are going to move that commodity and therefore displace others. So congestion is always a significant issue, I believe, for the railroads. One thing, there's of course the negative side, but the positive side is that if you invest in all of this infrastructure, it benefits not only, if you invest, for example, in a route that carries crude oil, you're obviously also investing in that same route that carries passenger rail and grain, and ultimately the more investment you put into that rail network, the more commodities you're going to benefit, alleviate some of that congestion, prevent derailment. So I think there's the upside is that the positive effects then ripple out towards all the commodities and passenger as well. So I think there's, passenger and freight both run on the same tracks, and I think ultimately, if you invest in it, you're going to make everybody safer. So I think that's the upside.
Let me add one other thing, and it's sort of tangential, which is the issue we talked about earlier about speed. Because I wear two hats, I represent the refining industry, but I also represent the petrochemical side. The speed issue, and as Beth mentioned, the congestion issue is an important one, because if you're having congested areas or you're having these lower speeds, then the petrochemical guys aren't getting, and the grain guys and everybody else aren't getting their products out. And so there's this ripple effect, and the railroads have pointed out the sort of efficiency problems when you go from, let's say, a 40-mile-an-hour to a 30-mile-an-hour speed. It has a huge ripple effect on efficiency and getting products out. And so that grain, which is already sitting in silos, may sit even longer, and it becomes very problematic.
Are you talking about the speed restrictions as a consequence of the new train?
I'm just generally talking about the speed issue. That the speed issue comes into play, although what I've also been told by the rail folks is that they're not always meeting those speeds anyway. So if it was reduced to 40 miles an hour, then they have told us that they're only getting 40 miles an hour on certain routes anyway. So it may not effectively may not even matter. But I'm really talking about congestion and speed and the impact overall, the impact that it has on moving traffic overall.
Okay.
Time of day is a factor too.
Yeah.
So in the East Coast refineries, for example, that are now relying on crude by rail from the Bakken oil fields, maybe 40–50% of it, we're seeing unit trains coming into the Philadelphia, Delaware region on a daily basis, but they come in at night. So that when they're on the Northeast corridor, they're operating in an off-peak period. And so there's some time of day issues that can also be adjusted as passenger and freight rail occupy the same space.
Can I ask one follow-up? Does the Hudson River Tunnel project have an impact for petroleum movement or not? Is that not something that's too much on your radar because you use different routes?
Beth, I don't know this. I'm assuming that there are no crude trains running.
Yeah.
No.
So it'd only be secondary impact that you guys would consider.
having refineries there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, question all the way in the back.
Hi, Nicole Merlane from Invest in the USA, the EB5 Immigrant Investor Program. So I am coming at it from, I guess, a different perspective of a private investor. There are multiple EB5 projects that have invested in infrastructure and rail projects, including the one that Sean mentioned in Orlando, from Orlando to Miami, is a major EB5 project, and also one from Minneapolis to, I think, Rochester. And so I was wondering what different obstacles there were for P3 cooperation between private investors and local, state, federal government, and like in what ways can we, is it easier to facilitate that relationship? I guess what my question is what obstacles are there to having private investment in building rail and et cetera infrastructure?
Well, I mean, I'd be interested, there's a number of different ways you can look at this, and that is the actual operations of the trains themselves, the building of the infrastructure, the maintenance of the infrastructure, which is a whole separate category, and then some of the services you provide on board. The infrastructure is the most important one because it's kind of it's the first thing that has to happen for you to run a train and run a train efficiently. It's also the hardest. The only country that really has had a infrastructure management firm make money is, to my knowledge, is Japan Railway East. And the way they did that was they gave them land parcels and said you can go and develop office residential space around your stations and use that real estate revenue to finance operations of this transportation corridor. It's kind of what FEC and all of what Florida are doing. There's opportunities on the Northeast corridor, but it's going to take. I think it would take more political will than currently exists. I mean, if you think about the Hudson Yards real estate development that is happening right above Penn Station, it's the biggest private real estate development going on in the world right now.
100% EB5.
Oh yeah? Okay. And it wouldn't work without the Hudson River tunnels. It wouldn't work without Penn Station. How are you going to get people in and out and have there's a lot of commercial real estate and office space that is going to be relying on transportation, but they're not really paying anything into maintenance of the transportation network other than corporate tax rates. So those are the restrictions on that front. I think there's going to be a lot more. Like let's say California, if the state of California can secure federal help and build the infrastructure, they're going to lease it out to a private company. They're going to do it across 20, 30-year leases, and that will be a revenue stream. You've seen that model produced. And in terms of onboard amenities, we're seeing, maybe we talk about the Downeaster experience and how they really, rather than going through Amtrak to provide food to customers or provide Wi-Fi to customers, they went to other vendors. We've seen something happen in Indianapolis recently with Iowa Pacific taking over the Hoosier State. I think it'll be interesting to see how much money they can make and whether they can make that work. But as these urban corridors get more dense and there's more ridership, it's going to be a market that I think people are looking into, and it just requires some flexibility from Amtrak to let them come in and because Amtrak food and beverage is just a constant headache politically, and I'm ready to stop talking about it. And it needs to, there needs to be food and beverage service, but if it satisfies some Republican transportation infrastructure committee members to have McDonald's on board,
In Maine, they use some private vendor that brought in signature foodstuffs that fit the state
Yeah.
model. Clam chowder, for example, on the train going to Maine, that's a pretty good mix. A model sandwich, for example. And there's a different experience for those passengers. But you're right, the private investment is also happening on the highway side. Most of the roads that we're building today are through, states are using toll revenues to build toll roads now because the highway trust fund is in such tough shape. And on the railway side, you're talking about high-speed corridors, don't you? Was that
Yeah.
what referring to in California as high-speed rail?
Yeah.
That's a whole other discussion that's impacting certain growth areas. The southeast high-speed rail corridor, for example, going from Atlanta all the way to DC. North Carolina is different in that they have a state-owned railroad that most states don't have. But there's a section in Virginia that CSX owns that needs to be part of the high-speed rail equation. So that means that a partnership with a private rail company that needs to happen before that can be effectively done. So it takes a real champion in each state to continue those projects forward because they can be bogged down by political battles along the way. But if you have a vision for something you want to accomplish, then people can support that kind of vision.
Another obstacle that you might not think about is Buy America provisions, and I know I think one project that kind of sunk because they had financing from, I think, a Chinese train manufacturer. Was looking at, they basically have an Exim bank of their own to try to find markets for Chinese technology, and they said we could do it cheaper than an American-based company, but it was the Las Vegas to Southern California line, and they said if you want a federal loan, it wasn't even a grant, it was like a RIF loan, and you gotta abide by Buy American provisions. And so Express West said, we're gonna shelf this project for big on this.
I'll get to both of you, but up front, sir.
Oh, yeah, Blake Subcheck with Energy Wire. I just had a question on the crude by rail front. I know Cynthia Quarterman, before she left, kind of emphasized that the big tank car rule was only the beginning, and the regulators are going to continue to look at all their options, et cetera. Was that just rhetoric, or what do you see on the menu for future regulations on hazardous materials safety regulations coming out of PHMSA or FRA?
Well, there's a 2-year study that they're doing right now on stabilization. So I think that stabilization and characteristics there is going to be a big issue probably the next 2 years.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is it's a study, so
Yes.
we're not, as we've said, and we've done multiple studies, as has AFPM, looking at crude oil and, as we've said, it's properly characterized as a flammable liquid, so we don't, right now I think it's important that we let that research be done before talking about any regulations in that arena. But separate and apart from that, there's also a regulation that we're anticipating, an NPRM coming out of DOT on oil spill response for rails. So that's in the pipeline, I guess. And then aside from that, I don't know of any that we're anticipating.
Yes.
Hi, Rachel Levin, Bloomberg BNI. I have 2 questions, so sorry. The first one is focusing on that workforce issue that I believe Beth mentioned. And I'm more focused on kind of the hazmat transportation side of it. Where are you seeing those workforce kind of vacancies or future vacancies? Is it more on the engineering side, or are these more remedial roles? And how does that affect kind of innovation and the potential for moving forward and developing safer and more environmentally friendly routes or technologies for transportation? And then the second question is kind of related to data use, which I believe that David was talking about. The government obviously already collects a lot of data, and one thing that you hear consistently from industry and others is that they're not adequately using the data that they have. And so I was wondering, on the hazardous materials transportation front, what type of data is the most useful that the government has that it's not already adequately using, and where is there room for growth for the government to collect meaningful data that it's not already collecting? So that's a lot.
I'm happy to tackle the first one on, sorry, could you restate it? Oh, yes, the workforce, right. I think primarily what we're seeing is a lack of, for example, skilled welders, and more on that engineering side. What a lot of the railroads seem to have done is, since there aren't that many skilled engineers or skilled welders or whatever the role is, they've taken the training in-house to make sure that their folks are properly trained, and develop those skills internally within the companies. So I think there's a huge dearth in that.
And we in our
Skill
own
force.
industries have the same problem. Welders, for example, the number I've heard is the average age of a welder now is 55. So there's a great need for welding for our contractors working in refineries, petrochemical facilities, and chemical plants for that matter.
And welders are a critical workforce for all of our industries. Making sure that the welds are properly done on a rail can literally make or break the rail. So, that's, I think, a critical element and something that all of the workforce, I think there's a lot of efforts by all of the different industries and companies to engage people early on, a younger workforce, and also reach out to different groups, for example, women, to get, a more diverse workforce engaged. But I anticipate it'll become a larger issue than it even is now.
And your second question about data and what data is available and already available to first responders, what's useful about it or not useful. In this country, we have state emergency response commissions, the CERCs, that are statewide committees of state representatives, and then every county or group of counties have a local emergency planning committee, or LEPC. Most LEPCs in this country follow county boundaries, and they're made up of representatives from industry and local government, first responders, fire officials, schools, even the media are represented at local emergency planning committees. And they get tier 2 data from industry on a regular basis. So they know about industry data in terms of stored volume of hazardous materials at that industry. Problem is, that only is one piece of the equation. Once at the industry, it's different than how it gets there. And it's the rail and truck and pipeline and barge movements from suppliers to these industries that is harder to get. That kind of data is typically proprietary because suppliers use different carriers and they're very competitive, and they want to try to get the information, the product where it needs to go. First responders, to get that data, sometimes have to work more closely with industry to get it. And that just requires more time because it means calling multiple. The hazmat person in industry, for example, won't know about volumes. And the best information for first responders to know the volume transported through their community, right? But the hazmat guy at that community is not going to know, at that industry is not going to know volume. That's a sales person. When we talk to the salesperson in that industry, they're going to say, have we talked to legal yet? And legal's going to say, so you get into an industry discussion. We've been able to do that as a company because we serve as a liaison between industry and government, so we can sometimes get that information. But in order to make it useful, you have to aggregate it together with by chemical, and that's what makes it not proprietary. For example, if you take one chemical and you get all the ways that chemical shipped through that state by all these different sources, then it's no longer proprietary. It's the aggregate total. So annual volumes are a way that we try to help first responders know what's going through their town. And rail companies will provide annual volumes if you ask them. They've provided it to first responders and to counties for years on a local case-by-case basis. I think this broader interest in all these national volumes that's causing a lot of consternation, I think, for the rail companies. On a case-by-case basis, we work very closely with first responders, and that West Virginia example I gave you is a good case in point. They already knew what was going through their town because they'd done their homework. So you can get the information, it just takes time. And that's what I think first responders are struggling with, is getting that information in a timely fashion.
And if I could just ask one follow-up question to that, there is, in the rule that just came out, that we've been discussing on high-passenger loading trains, there is a section that they reverted back to their, I believe it was the safety advisory, previous emergency order.
State Emergency Response Commissions now have to request the data instead of the railroads providing the data. It's actually both. Both are still in effect. The emergency order from 2014 is still in effect. Railroads still need to notify those states through which 1 million gallons or more of the Bakken crude is transported.
Right, but the idea of that is to identify the correct person, right? So seemingly that should take out a lot of the hassle and kind of difficulties that first responders have been having, right? To identify the correct person that they can contact, and so then it's just a discussion between two people rather than and do you think that is the solution? Is that gonna work? Or is that working?
That's actually always been the case. That's always been in place. The railroads have had a designated person to be able to supply local first responders with those types of requests. That really hasn't changed.
I hope you all really enjoyed what I thought was a very thoughtful and informative discussion. At AII, one of the things that we're excited about is something that came up in the middle of the discussion about what technologies are either out there right now or are being worked on out there that can really help improve rail safety, whether it's automated track inspection or different kinds of sensors. So we're going to continue to look at that moving forward, and we're excited about that. And finally, thank you so much to the panelists and for Jason for taking time out of their busy schedules to provide us all with valuable insight on rail safety from a number of different perspectives, which I think is really helpful to get the passenger and the freight and some of the more technical aspects and response and all that sort of stuff. So at this point, we're going to wrap it up. If anyone would like to speak to Brigham or myself about AII, we're certainly available for as long as you need us. I don't want to volunteer the panelists individually, not sure what their schedules are like, but I guess grab them by the arm on a case-by-case basis if you'd like to talk to them. So thank you all so much, and we'll wrap it up for you.
Yeah.